So in this video, we're going to deploy our final blog project to Heroku so that it can be viewed live and used by other users, but you'll see how this presents a problem for hosting some Node.js services on platforms like Heroku, and we'll go through the steps to getting the application completely live. So let's follow the steps through from the previous video where we deployed to Heroku, and the first thing we'll do is set up our project as a Git repository. And I've just added the node modules folder to our git ignore file so that we don't actually commit the library files to the repository, because these will get rebuilt when we deploy to Heroku. So with that set up, let's actually create a new Heroku app. And just for starters, let's actually push our files directly to Heroku and see what that does on the live site. And let's browse to the URL that Heroku has given to us. And as you can see, when the page loads, we're actually getting an error. The blog application isn't loading for us. And there's a suggestion to go and have a look at the Heroku logs, which we can do on the command line with the Heroku logs command. So we're looking at the logs that are stored on the Heroku web server, and this is kind of what you would see in your local console if you were running your Node.js application locally. And you can see we've got some errors in there, so if we scroll up the logs a little bit, you can see we've got this Mongo network error where we've got a connection refused message. And the reason for that is really simple, is that Heroku doesn't have any local support for MongoDB databases, and if you remember, we set up our connection string for MongoDB to look on the local host, which is the server that our app is running on. So the simplest way to get around this is to actually host your MongoDB database on a separate provider, and just update the connection string that the client is using within your code to look for your data in that other provider. So a provider that you can use is directly through MongoDB. They actually provide you with free sandbox accounts that you can use to test out your applications. So you can head on over to their website and actually get an account for free. Once you've logged in and created your account, you'll get a dashboard that looks a little bit like this. And in order to set up a new database, if you head on over to the Build New Cluster button in the right hand corner, you see you get some options in creating a new cluster which will host your database, and you'll see that there are options in terms of who provides it, where it's actually hosted, and the size of your database. But if you just make sure that you've selected the sandbox option, you can see you get 512 megabytes of storage, and there's no cost involved with that. So I've already got a cluster set up on this account, which I'm actually going to use as the data store for our final blog project. And when your cluster's set up, first thing to do is to go over to the Network Access tab and configure some IP addresses that are actually allowed to access this MongoDB database. So if you're going to create a security-wise production-ready database system, you would probably want to make sure that this is available from only certain locations. But because this is just for testing at the moment, and without going into a whole lesson on networking and IP addressing, we can just click the button to say allow access from anywhere, and then click confirm. And it can take a few moments to set up, but once you've got the active sign under the status, then your cluster can be accessed from any location, such as your computer, or as we want to do, from the Heroku platform. So the next thing we need to do is actually create a username and password that will be allowed to access the database. So if we head back on over to clusters, and then click the connect button, you can then create a new MongoDB user, and I'm just going to call this final blog, and I'll also set the password as the same. And with that user setup, if you click on choose a connection method and then click on connect your application, you can see it gives us a connection string that we can replace in our application that will allow it to connect to this particular MongoDB cluster. So in our app.js file, we could just replace the MongoDB connection string that we have here with the one that we've just created in the MongoDB cloud provider. However, what might be a bit more flexible is to actually create this connection string in Heroku as an environment variable and then use that inside of our app.js file, which will help keep things a bit more secure and also flexible if we actually want to change provider at a later point. So in our Heroku admin panel, if we just select the app that we've just created, and in the settings tab, we'll go to the section called config vars, and in here we can set up environment variables that can be accessed throughout our Node.js application. So here I've just created a new config variable called db_connection and set it to the connection string that we got from the cloud provider. So now back in our app.js code, instead of hard coding the connection string to connect to MongoDB, we can just access that environment variable, and when the app is running, it will use this DB connection string as the location to retrieve and store our data. So in the terminal, let's actually commit this to our repository and push it to Heroku. So now when we go back to our app in the browser, refreshing the page, we now get our default Express index template. And if we go to the register page, for example, you can see the code for the final blog project is running, and if we try and register a username and log in, we're then taken to the page to create a new post. So we know that the database is there and accepting new users. And creating a post saves it into the MongoDB cloud provider and then allows us to access it when we visit the post's root. So whilst that might seem a bit of a pain to get an app with a database working correctly on Heroku, we've actually done a couple of things. We've increased the security of our application by removing the connection string to our database, and we've also increased its flexibility and resilience by using a cloud provider to host our MongoDB data.